Imagine opening a centuries-old prayer book, expecting solemn saints and sacred scripture, and instead finding a rabbit in full armor chasing a hunter with a spear, a monk sneaking a drink during Vespers, or a knight in a full suit of armor tilting at a tiny, unimpressed snail. This is the strange and wonderful world of medieval marginalia, a hidden universe of art tucked into the borders of some of history's most important manuscripts. For generations, these drawings were dismissed as the doodles of bored scribes, the weird afterthoughts of artists with too much time and too little supervision. But what if these images were something far more intentional, far more subversive? What if, within these illuminated margins, medieval people were telling jokes, sharing frustrations, and speaking truths they could never voice aloud? These corners of parchment became a secret canvas, a place where the rigid rules of medieval society could be playfully or pointedly appended. While the central text might preach piety and order, the margins whispered of rebellion, satire, and the sheer, joyful absurdity of being human. In an age where direct criticism of the church or the crown could be dangerous, even deadly, these visual winks and coded messages offered a rare space for free expression. They are a testament to the universal human need to question authority, to find humor in hardship, and to leave a personal mark on an impersonal world. This is not just art, it is archaeology of the everyday mind, a direct line into the hopes, fears, and laughter of people who lived centuries ago. In this video, we're going to journey deep into these illuminated margins. We will meet the anonymous monks and artists who risked their safety to sketch these subversive scenes. We'll decode their inside jokes, their social critiques, and their uncensored observations about power, faith, and daily life. You'll see how a seemingly silly drawing of a fox preaching to a flock of geese is actually a sharp critique of clerical hypocrisy, and how a bizarre hybrid creature is more than a monster. It's a meditation on the boundaries of the known world. This is a story about finding voice in the silence and truth in the corners, and it will forever change how you see the Middle Ages. So get ready to look closer, because the most fascinating history isn't always written in the main text. Sometimes it's hiding in the margins, waiting to be discovered. Picture a monastic scribe in a quiet, dimly lit scriptorium, his hand carefully tracing the sacred words of a psalm onto a page of prepared vellum. The work is slow, demanding, deeply reverent. Then, almost as if moved by a force outside himself, his quill drifts to the wide, empty border framing the text. In a few quick strokes, a mischievous, grinning gargoyle appears, peering over the holy words as if sharing a private joke. This is not a moment of distraction or disrespect. This is marginalia in action, a deliberate, complex, and deeply human practice that turns the blank spaces of a manuscript into a vibrant secondary canvas. The term itself comes from the Latin word margo, simply meaning margin, but marginalia encompasses so much more than its etymological roots suggest. It includes everything from intricate floral borders and heraldic shields to bizarre hybrid creatures, scenes of daily labor, and even surprisingly crude cartoons. For a long time, art historians dismissed these features as the meaningless doodles of artisans bored with their tedious work. We now understand this couldn't be further from the truth. These drawings were intentional, layered with meaning, and served a multitude of purposes. They were a creative outlet, a space for personal expression within a highly regimented environment, and often a covert method of social or religious critique. Medievalist Michael Camille, in his groundbreaking book Image on the Edge, brilliantly framed this relationship as a visual dialogue. The central text, usually a religious or legal document, held the official, authoritative message. The Marginalia, however, could talk back. It could reinforce the text's message with a supportive visual example, but it could also parody it, subvert it, or question it entirely. A solemn passage on piety might be flanked by a drawing of a fox dressed as a preacher, delivering a sermon to a flock of gullible geese, a clear and safely indirect jab at clerical hypocrisy. This practice flourished particularly during the Gothic period, from the 12th to the 15th centuries, when the design of books began to incorporate wider margins, effectively inviting artists to fill them with life. Understanding marginalia as a thoughtful and meaningful component of the manuscript is crucial because it transforms these books from mere vessels of text into rich historical records. They are diaries of society's subconscious, reflecting the anxieties, humor, preoccupations, and complexities of the medieval world that official histories often leave out. The next time you see an image of a knight jousting a snail or a rabbit sieging a castle, ask yourself not, why is that there, but what is it trying to say? The answer reveals a fascinating world of hidden voices, using the safety of the margin to express truths that had no place in the center. Now, imagine the daily reality of that scribe. His world was one of intense discipline and repetition, governed by the strict horarium or daily schedule of the monastery. The day began long before sunrise with matins, the first prayer service, and was segmented by the canonical hours, with work in the Scriptorium filling the time between prayers. This was not a leisurely artistic pursuit. It was a form of laborious, devout worship. The act of copying text was seen as preserving the very word of God, a sacred duty that demanded absolute accuracy and concentration. The pressure was immense. A single error could mean days of work meticulously scraping the ink from the costly vellum with a knife to correct it. In this context of silent, painstaking effort, the margins represented a tiny zone of personal freedom. When the scribe's hand drifted from the rigid lines of text to sketch a whimsical creature in the border, it was more than a doodle. It was a momentary reclaiming of individuality within a life dedicated to the collective and the divine. This creative impulse served as a vital psychological pressure valve. The margins became a space to vent the universal frustrations of any dedicated worker. A common motif is the depiction of a monk mirroring the artist himself, fast asleep at his desk, head propped on his hand. It's a humorous, deeply relatable admission of exhaustion and human fallibility. Other images playfully exaggerate the discomforts of the job. We see scribes complaining of the cold, rubbing their hands together, or even, in one famous example, throwing his pen down in a fit of comic exasperation. These weren't acts of rebellion against faith itself, but rather a gentle pushback against the grueling physical and mental demands of their pious work. They are visual sighs, a way to say, "This is hard," and in sharing that joke with an imagined future reader, the scribe found a small measure of solace and connection. Interestingly, evidence suggests this practice was often quietly sanctioned by the very authorities who enforced the strict rules. Some abbots and priors, recognizing the immense mental toll of such focused work, likely tolerated or even encouraged this marginal creativity as a necessary concession to maintain morale and prevent burnout among their most skilled craftsmen. A happy scribe was a productive scribe. In a way, the margin acted as a designated sandbox for play, allowing a controlled release of creative energy that ultimately helped the monk return to his sacred task refreshed and focused. This tacit permission reveals a sophisticated understanding of human psychology by medieval monastic leaders they recognized that a touch of the profane could, paradoxically, protect and enhance the sacred. This balance between piety and playfulness is the defining characteristic of the Scriptorium's secret art. The same hand that meticulously formed the letters of a psalm could, moments later, sketch a monkey stealing fruit right next to those holy words. This wasn't a contradiction to the medieval mind. It reflected a worldview that could hold both the solemn and the silly in tension. The sacred text was immutable and revered, but the world around it, the human world, was messy, funny, and flawed. The margin was the perfect meeting point for these two realities. It allowed the scribe to acknowledge his own humanity without diminishing his devotion, creating a complex, layered masterpiece that is both a work of profound faith and a testament to the enduring, irrepressible human spirit. But the sacred space of the Scriptorium was not the only world these artists knew. They lived in a society rigidly structured by class, power, and often profound inequality. And it was into the margins that they poured their sharpest observations about this world, crafting a visual language of satire so clever and coded that it could critique the most powerful institutions without its creator ever signing their name. This is where the medieval sense of humor truly shines, not as simple doodles, but as a sophisticated and daring form of social commentary. Imagine a world turned utterly upside down, where the hunter becomes the hunted. This is the world turned upside down topos, and it was a favorite tool of the marginal artist. In these scenes, rabbits, the quintessential prey, become the aggressors. They are depicted as armored knights laying siege to castles, as physicians administering dubious cures to humans, and as hunters carrying their human captives slung over their backs on a pole. This reversal of the natural order was a powerful and instantly understandable metaphor. For a peasantry constantly at the mercy of their lords, the image of a rabbit triumphing over a human was a fantastical inversion of their daily reality, a brief, humorous vision of the underdog winning. It allowed them to laugh at the very structure of power that held them down, and in that laughter there was a tiny, potent seed of critique. Another persistent and puzzling motif is the brave knight, the pinnacle of chivalric virtue, engaged in mortal combat with a most unworthy opponent, a common garden snail. This bizarre image appears in the margins of countless manuscripts, from prayer books to legal texts. The knight, clad in full armor and mounted on a mighty destrier, charges with his lance or cowers behind his shield, all aimed at a tiny, harmless mollusk. Scholars have debated the meaning for generations. Is it a parody of the Lombard knights, who were sometimes mocked for their cowardice? Could the snail, with its hard shell that resembles a helmet, be a symbol of the inevitability of death that no amount of armor can truly defeat? Or is it simply a joke about the absurdity of chivalric culture itself, a culture that often preached lofty ideals of honor and bravery, but was, in practice, frequently consumed by vanity, pointless aggression, and frivolous quests? The very ambiguity is the point. It was a safe joke because its meaning was never explicit. A lord flipping through his expensive prayer book might chuckle at the silly picture, completely missing the fact that he and his entire social class were likely the butt of the joke. The most dangerous target for this satire, however, was the church. Open criticism of clerical corruption could lead to accusations of heresy with severe consequences. But the margins provided a sanctuary for this dissent. Artists used animal allegories to make their points safely. A frequent scene shows a fox, a well-known symbol of trickery and deceit, dressed in the robes of a preaching monk or bishop. He stands at a pulpit delivering a sermon to a captivated congregation of geese. The geese, representing the gullible common people, listen with rapt attention, completely unaware that the fox is merely fattening them up for his next meal. This image is a scorching indictment of clerical hypocrisy, a warning against false preachers who use the language of faith to exploit their flocks. Other margins show more direct, human-based satire. Monks rolling dice on the altar instead of praying, nuns primping and preening in their habits, or portly abbots indulging in extravagant feasts. These images highlighted the glaring gap between the spiritual ideals the Church professed and the all-too-human failings of its representatives. For a population taught that their eternal salvation depended on these very figures, such images were not just funny, they were a vital, subversive acknowledgement of a widely felt tension. Through the protective veil of humor, Marginalia gave a voice to the voiceless, allowing them to question authority and laugh in the face of power, ensuring that even in a world of strict hierarchies, the human desire to critique and mock those in charge could never be entirely silenced. If the satirical animals offered a laugh with a critical edge, the grotesques and hybrids that crawled and flew through the margins plunged viewers into a far more unsettling and philosophically complex realm. These were not just funny rabbits or parodying foxes. These were beings that defied the very order of God's creation. A man with the legs of a goat, a bird with a human face singing from a branch, a dog with a serpent's tail. These chimerical figures were known as grotesques, and their purpose was far more profound than simple decoration. They represented the medieval fascination with the boundaries of the known world, a visual exploration of the liminal spaces between the human, the animal, the divine, and the demonic. In a society that believed the world was a carefully ordered hierarchy ordained by God, these creatures were powerful symbols of chaos and the unknown. The margins of the map, both literal and metaphorical, were filled with monsters. Travelers' tales and bestiaries spoke of dog-headed men in the east and other wonders, and the manuscript margin became the perfect place to give these rumors a terrifyingly vivid form. By placing them literally on the edge of the sacred text, artists were visually wrestling with a fundamental question. If God's creation is perfect and orderly, what are we to make of these bizarre aberrations? Their presence served as a humbling reminder that for all of human knowledge, there were still vast, unexplored, and terrifying wonders in the world, reflecting a deep-seated anxiety about the limits of understanding and the perils of the unfamiliar. Yet the grotesque was rarely just about fear. These hybrids also functioned as intricate moral and spiritual lessons. A common motif was the siren, often depicted as a woman with the tail of a fish or the body of a bird, luring sailors to their doom with her enchanting song. This was not merely a mythical creature, it was a direct allegory for the sin of lust and the dangers of temptation that could shipwreck the soul. A figure with the face of a man and the body of a beast might symbolize how giving in to base, animalistic desires could corrupt one's humanity. In this sense, the grotesque was a form of moral mirror, showing the viewer a distorted reflection of their own potential for sin and the monstrous transformation that could occur if virtue was abandoned. The artist was acting as a moral theologian, using shock and strangeness to make the lesson unforgettable. This exploration of the liminal, the in-between, also touched on deeper questions of identity and transformation. What does it mean to be human? What separates us from the animals? By blurring these lines so inventively, medieval artists were probing the very essence of being. A hybrid creature could represent a state of spiritual transition, a soul caught between salvation and damnation. It could symbolize the duality of human nature itself, the constant internal battle between reason and instinct, the spirit and the flesh. The very absurdity of a knight fighting a snail finds a darker cousin in these unsettling beings. Both use the irrational to comment on the human condition, but the grotesque does so with a chilling, philosophical weight that resonates long after the initial chuckle fades. Their enduring compulsion lies in this dual power, to frighten and to fascinate, to warn and to wonder, all while holding up a distorted mirror to the soul of the viewer. And just when you think the margins couldn't get more surprising, they reveal perhaps their most startling secret. Tucked beside solemn prayers and intricate biblical scenes, a different kind of imagery unfolds, one of unabashed physicality and intimate embraces. Here, in the borders of books meant for devotion, we find couples locked in passionate scenes, naked figures contorted in acrobatic positions, and a whole menagerie of suggestive and explicitly erotic imagery. This is not a case of a modern viewer projecting sensibilities onto the past. These images are undeniably, intentionally carnal. The shock comes from the jarring contrast, the sacred text preaching chastity and piety, while its very edges pulse with a vibrant and often humorous celebration of the flesh. So how do we reconcile this? Were these simply the medieval equivalent of hidden pornography? The answer is far more complex and reveals the nuanced medieval mind. For the most part, this erotic imagery was not created for titillation alone. In a deeply religious society, the body and its desires were a primary battleground for the soul. Many of these images served a clear moralizing or allegorical function. A common scene might show a man and woman entwined, but nearby, a demon lurks, ready to claim their souls, a stark visual warning that yielding to lust could lead to eternal damnation. In this context, the erotic image was a weapon against sin, using shock and visceral impact to make the consequences of vice unforgettable. It was a form of moral instruction, designed to provoke not arousal, but fear and revulsion, reinforcing the Church's teachings on the dangers of the flesh. Yet, to label all these images as simple warnings is to miss their subversive brilliance. The margin also provided a space to satirize and mock the very ideals of celibacy and purity that the central text enforced. This is where the medieval sense of humor shines in its most daring form. We see monks and nuns, those who had taken vows of chastity, depicted in compromising situations, sneaking kisses, sharing a bed, or being caught in blatantly scandalous acts. This wasn't just random bawdiness, it was a pointed and likely widely appreciated jab at the hypocrisy that could fester within powerful religious institutions. For the common people, and perhaps even for some lower-ranking clergy, these images were a way to acknowledge the open secret of human frailty, laughing at the impossible standards set by a distant and often out-of-touch hierarchy. It was a pressure valve, allowing for the acknowledgement that despite all the rules, people remained, in the end, human. Scholars like Joan Holliday suggest we view this imagery as a form of controlled exploration. The margin acted as a sanctioned space to engage with taboo subjects, sex, desire, the body, in a way that was otherwise forbidden in public discourse. It was a safe container for societal anxieties and fascinations. Take, for instance, the common motif of the unicorn. In one reading, the mythical beast that could only be tamed by a pure virgin was a powerful symbol of Christ and the Incarnation. But in the margins, this symbolism could be cleverly subverted. The same image of a woman with a unicorn resting its head in her lap could carry an undeniable sexual innuendo, playing on the tension between sacred and profane interpretations. This ambiguity was the artist's superpower. A wealthy patron or a pious monk could claim the image was a pious symbol, while a less orthodox viewer might share a knowing chuckle at the double meaning. This duality is what makes these scandalous margins so fascinating. They reveal a medieval society that was not simply repressive, but was deeply fascinated by and deeply conflicted about the human body and its pleasures. The margins became the arena where this conflict was playfully and sometimes shockingly worked out. They show us that medieval people thought about sex, joked about sex, and struggled with its moral implications just as we do today. The artist navigating this fine line between instruction and titillation was walking a cultural tightrope, using symbolism, humor, and audacity to explore the most human of desires, all under the protective and forgiving guise of the margin's liminal space. Beyond the grand satire of knights and snails, and even the unsettling allure of the grotesque, the margins hold perhaps their most precious treasure, a window into the everyday. Here, the medieval artist turns from critic to chronicler, capturing the vibrant, messy, and utterly relatable theater of daily existence. It's as if a tiny door swings open in the border of a prayer book, and we are invited to step through into the bustling reality of the 14th century. We don't see kings and saints in these scenes. We see the farmer bent double in his field, the fishmonger shouting her prices in the market, the children tumbling in playful games, and the harried housewife chasing a stray pig from her vegetable patch. This is history from the ground up, documented not in official chronicles, but in the spontaneous sketches of those who lived it. These snapshots are invaluable because they record the experiences of the vast majority of medieval people, the commoners whose lives were rarely deemed important enough for the main text. The central scripture might speak of eternal salvation, but the margin shows us the immediate, pressing concerns of survival and community. We see the backbreaking cycle of the agricultural year, men and women sowing seeds, harvesting wheat with sickles, and threshing grain. We feel the universal frustration of the laborer, depicted in scenes of a peasant shaking his fist at a sudden rainstorm that threatens his freshly cut hay, or a man desperately trying to shoo birds away from his crops. These weren't just generic depictions, they were observations filled with empathy and a knowing familiarity. The artist understands the precariousness of life, where one bad harvest or stolen chicken could mean hunger for a family. A particularly poignant motif shows a fox making off with a squawking goose, a moment of comic tragedy that any villager would instantly recognize. But it's the infusion of humor that truly brings these scenes to life, transforming them from simple records into shared jokes. The comedy is often physical, slapstick, and universally understandable. A man slips on a patch of ice and tumbles into a barrel. A woman, perhaps a baker's wife, brandishes a rolling pin at her cowering husband. Two drunken revelers lean against each other for support, their faces blurred in a happy stupor. This is not the sharp, satirical humor aimed at the powerful. This is the warm, communal laughter of people laughing at themselves and the shared absurdities of life. It served a vital psychological purpose. In a world defined by hard labor, disease, and uncertainty, the ability to find humor in a minor mishap was a form of resilience. That drawing of a peasant chasing a thief who'd stolen his shoes wasn't just a joke. It was a way of saying, we all face this, we understand, and we can still laugh about it. This created a powerful bond between the book and its viewer. For a wealthy patron, these scenes might have been a charming, slightly sentimentalized view of rustic life. But for the literate monk or the lower-ranking cleric, many of whom came from humble backgrounds themselves, these images were a reflection of the world they knew. They bridged the immense gap between the lofty, often abstract language of the liturgy and the tangible, smellable, feelable reality of human experience. The prayer book became more than a sacred object. It became a familiar friend, its pages containing not only the path to God, but also a mirror of God's creation in all its gritty, glorious detail. By documenting the full spectrum of life, the toil, the festivals, the quarrels, and the games, the marginal artists affirmed the value of the everyday. They declared that the human experience, in all its ordinary beauty and comedy, was worthy of a place alongside the divine, forever preserved in the precious borders of a book. Think about the immense challenge of learning in the Middle Ages, long before the printing press made books widely available. For a student in a monastery or a university, knowledge wasn't just something to be understood. It was a vast treasure to be memorized, from lengthy passages of scripture to complex philosophical arguments. In this world where the written word was precious and scarce, the mind itself was the primary library. And just like any good librarian, a medieval scholar needed a clever filing system. This is where the margins truly shone, not as a space for rebellion, but as a brilliant, practical classroom tool. The artists and scribes who filled these borders were, in effect, the world's first instructional designers, creating powerful visual aids that transformed abstract, difficult concepts into unforgettable pictures. This practice tapped into an ancient and well-understood principle of memory. The mind recalls images far more easily than it does words alone. A complex idea like the ladder of virtues, a theological concept outlining the steps to spiritual perfection, could be difficult to hold in one's head. But a drawing of an actual ladder with each rung labeled with a virtue like humility or charity, and a tiny figure climbing toward heaven provided a concrete roadmap. The image itself became the trigger. A monk preparing for a sermon or meditation needed only to recall that peculiar ladder in the margin, and the entire structure of the concept would unfold in his mind. Similarly, the constant struggle between good and evil within the soul was vividly depicted as a literal battle in the borders. We see personifications of the 7 virtues, often as noble knights or graceful women, doing combat with the 7 vices, portrayed as monstrous, grotesque figures. This visual shorthand made the internal, spiritual battle external and dramatically clear, serving as a constant, memorable reminder of the path one was supposed to follow. Beyond these grand moral allegories, Marginalia also served more straightforward educational purposes. In legal texts, a complex point of law might be clarified by a scene illustrating its application, or, more humorously, its absurd misapplication. A botanical treatise could feature surprisingly accurate drawings of plants in the margins, helping a medical student identify herbs. These images acted as annotations, footnotes, and study guides long before such things were formally invented. They provided a layer of commentary and clarification that made dense texts more accessible, especially for those who were still learning or whose literacy was more visual than textual. For a layperson being read to, these images would have been crucial for following along and understanding the narrative, making the book a multi-sensory experience that engaged both the ear and the eye. The effectiveness of this method reveals a deep understanding of how people learn. By engaging multiple senses, these illustrated manuscripts became dynamic, interactive tools. A reader wasn't just passively absorbing words, they were actively decoding images, making connections between the text and the picture, and creating a richer, more layered memory in the process. This transformed the act of reading from a solitary deciphering of symbols into an immersive dialogue with the book itself. The margin became a teacher's aid, a study partner, and a memory palace all rolled into one, ensuring that the knowledge contained within those precious pages wasn't just seen, but truly seen, understood, and remembered. Now let's pull back the curtain on the workshop itself, to the physical reality of ink, vellum, and painstaking labor that brought these whimsical margins into being. The creation of an illuminated manuscript was an astonishingly complex and costly endeavor, a symphony of specialized skills where every participant, from the parchment maker to the master illustrator, was a virtuoso of their craft. It all began not with a pen but with a knife. The finest parchment, known as vellum, was made from the skin of calves, sheep, or goats. these skins underwent a revolting yet transformative process. They were soaked in lime to remove hair and flesh, scraped meticulously thin, stretched on frames to dry, and finally polished with pumice stone until they achieved a smooth, flawless writing surface. The quality of this canvas was paramount. A single blemish or uneven patch could ruin weeks of work. This was not paper, but a form of leather, a precious and durable material that speaks to the immense value these books held. Upon this prepared surface, the scribe would first go to work, carefully copying the text using quills cut from the feathers of geese or swans. But before a single word was written, the entire page would have been lightly ruled with a stylus, creating the invisible grid that would guide both text and image, ensuring perfect alignment. The scribe worked with iron gall ink, a deep, lasting black made from oak galls, iron sulfate, and gum arabic. It was a testament to their skill that they could write with such consistency and grace, knowing that a single error meant carefully scraping away the costly ink and vellum with a knife, a high-pressure task with no true undo button. Only after the words were set could the limner or illustrator begin their magic. Their palette was a treasure trove of colors ground from minerals, plants, and even insects, each mixed with egg white or gum to create tempera paint. Lapis lazuli, a semi-precious stone imported from distant Afghanistan, provided a brilliant, celestial blue so expensive it was often reserved for the robes of the Virgin Mary. Vermilion, a vibrant red, came from toxic mercury sulfide. Greens were made from verdigris, the green rust that forms on copper, and yellows from saffron or arsenic-based orpiment. And then there was the gold. The application of gold leaf was the pinnacle of the illuminator's art. Areas meant to gleam were first painted with a sticky gum or gesso, raised slightly from the page. The delicate gold leaf was then laid upon it and burnished to a dazzling, reflective brilliance that caught the light and truly made the page seem illuminated from within. This is where techniques like grisaille, painting entirely in shades of gray to mimic sculpture, and chiaroscuro, the dramatic use of light and shadow, came into play, adding a stunning sense of depth and realism to the bizarre creatures and figures inhabiting the margins. A grotesque painted in grisaille might look like a stone gargoyle peering from the edge of the page, while a scene using strong chiaroscuro could make a battling knight and snail feel startlingly dramatic and immediate. The fact that such sophisticated artistic techniques were lavished on what we might consider doodles is the clearest possible evidence that marginalia was never an afterthought. The time, cost, and sheer artistic mastery involved prove these images were an integral and valued part of the whole. This was rarely the work of a solitary genius. The production of a major manuscript was a collaborative studio effort, a medieval assembly line of artistry. A lead artist, the master, might design the major scenes and layouts while specialists took over specific tasks. One artisan might be renowned for their intricate foliage borders, another a specialist in painting expressive faces, and yet another a master of the drolleries and grotesques that filled the margins. This division of labor explains the incredible diversity of styles we often see within a single book. It also highlights the fascinating balance these artists had to strike. They worked within incredibly strict constraints: the size of the margin, the themes approved by the patron, the overall layout of the page. Yet within those confines, they were given a remarkable degree of creative freedom. The specific joke, the unique twist on a common motif, the personality in a monkey's expression. This was where the individual artist could imprint their own genius and humor onto a collective masterpiece. Their challenge was not a lack of creativity, but rather the thrilling task of channeling that boundless imagination through the eye of a very fine brush onto a precious piece of prepared skin, ensuring their contribution was both structurally perfect and brilliantly inventive. So far, we've seen how Marginalia offered a personal escape for the scribe and a sharp tool for social satire. But these artists didn't just invent their strange menageries from thin air. They were masterful magpies, drawing from a deep and shared well of stories that everyone in their culture would have known. The margins became a breathtaking crossroads where the sacred world of the text met the sprawling, vibrant universe of popular belief. Picture a monk meticulously illustrating the story of David and Goliath. As his quill moves to the border, his mind wanders to a tale his grandmother told him of a clever fox outwitting a bear, and suddenly there it is, sketched right beside the biblical giant's fall, a visual echo of the underdog's triumph, connecting a universal theme across sacred and secular lines. This practice of weaving folklore into the fabric of a holy book reveals a medieval mindset that saw the world as a single, interconnected story, all part of God's creation. A bestiary description of a unicorn, a symbol of Christ, might be flanked by a margin drawing of a hairy, wild man from the woods, a figure straight from local peasant folklore. To the medieval viewer, this wasn't a contradiction. Both creatures existed in the same imaginative landscape, one from learned tradition, the other from oral tales told around the fire. The artist was building a bridge, showing that divine truth could be found not only in scripture, but also in the patterns of nature and the morals of folk wisdom. A scene from Aesop's fables, like the tortoise and the hare, could serve as a perfect, instantly understandable parallel to a psalm about patience and perseverance, making the spiritual lesson feel immediate and grounded. Perhaps the most potent examples come from the vast cycle of stories surrounding King Arthur and his knights. These were not yet the dusty classics we see them as today. In the High Middle Ages, the Arthurian legends were the thrilling, contemporary pop culture of their time. To find a knight, unmistakably Lancelot, jousting in the margin of a Latin prayer book is a startling and delightful surprise. It demonstrates that the audience for these manuscripts, often the nobility, lived in both worlds simultaneously. Their identity was built on both devout Christian piety and the chivalric code of Arthur's court. By including Lancelot, the artist was speaking directly to the patron's own self-image, connecting the valor of a quest for the Holy Grail with the daily quest for salvation through prayer. This fusion made the manuscript personally resonant, a custom-made object that reflected the owner's entire worldview, from the chapel to the tournament field. This creative synthesis highlights the incredible adaptability of these anonymous artists. They were not mere copyists, they were cultural translators. They took stories that existed in the air, in song, and in spoken word, and pinned them down onto the page, reimagining them for a new context. A classical myth like the Battle of the Centaurs, known from ancient texts, might be redrawn with the armor and weapons of a medieval knight, making the ancient story feel immediate and relevant. A local legend about a dragon slaying saint like Saint George would be depicted with details borrowed from heraldry and contemporary warfare, rooting the miraculous event firmly in the familiar visual language of the day. This wasn't a lack of originality, it was a genius for relevance. By draping ancient tales in contemporary clothes, the artists ensured these old stories continued to speak powerfully to each new generation, their meanings enriched and expanded by their beautiful, bizarre, and thoughtful placement in the margins of faith. As we journey from the quiet scriptoria of isolated monasteries to the bustling courts of Europe, the very character of the Marginalia begins to shift and transform, taking on the distinct flavor of its homeland. The margins become a map, and the art within them a reflection of deep-seated cultural identities. Nowhere is this divergence more striking than when we place a lavish French prayer book from the 14th century beside a weighty English psalter from the same era. The French pages seem to burst with a carnivalesque energy, a world of playful, whimsical creatures known as drolleries. These are not mere monsters, they are characters in a silent comedy, apes dressed as physicians feeling the pulse of a bemused wolf, rabbits ringing church bells, and musicians with the bodies of birds performing on unlikely instruments. This is the art of the court, designed for the amusement and delight of an aristocratic audience. These books were incredible luxuries, status symbols commissioned by royalty and the high nobility. The margins in this context functioned as a form of visual entertainment, a reflection of the sophisticated, playful, and sometimes frivolous culture of the French court. The humor is light, the satire gentle, and the overall effect is one of delight and wonder, a testament to the wealth and refined taste of the patron who could afford such a magnificent and frankly fun object. Cross the Channel to England, however, and the mood in the margins often darkens considerably. While drolleries certainly appear, there is a stronger, more persistent current of the truly grotesque and a pronounced taste for moralizing imagery. English marginalia frequently feels less like a playful diversion and more like a stern lecture or an ominous warning. Here, the hybrid creatures are less likely to be charming musicians and more likely to be unsettling demons or embodiments of sin, their bodies contorted in ways that evoke discomfort rather than delight. We see more explicit scenes of the dance of death, with skeletons dragging emperors and popes alike to their graves, and vivid depictions of the torments of hell, where sinners are punished in creatively gruesome ways. This shift in tone can be traced directly to differing religious and political environments. England's monastic tradition was particularly strong and often maintained a more austere, introspective character compared to some continental counterparts. The shadow of the Norman conquest and subsequent periods of political turmoil may have also fostered a cultural mindset more preoccupied with themes of mortality, divine judgment, and the fleeting nature of worldly power. This isn't to say one style was purely frivolous and the other purely pious. The genius of marginalia lies in its complexity. Even within the most luxurious French book of hours, a drollery of a fox preaching to geese carries a sharp, satirical edge about clerical hypocrisy, a joke the noble owner would certainly understand. Conversely, an English psalter might feature a baffling scene of a knight fighting a snail right next to a depiction of the crucifixion, injecting a note of absurdist humor into its solemnity. The difference is one of emphasis and primary purpose. The French courtly style uses humor and fantasy as its primary language, wrapping its social commentary in a package of exquisite beauty and delight. The English aesthetic, often rooted in monastic production, leans harder into the grotesque and the moralizing, using shock and awe to reinforce spiritual lessons. By comparing these regional dialects of art, we see how the same basic vocabulary hybrid creatures, everyday scenes, animal allegories, could be arranged to speak in dramatically different accents, each telling us something profound about the soil from which it grew. Now consider the reader's experience, holding a book where the sacred and the profane exist in a single glance. This was not a passive act of reading but an active, almost conversational engagement with the page. The margin did not simply sit beside the text. It spoke to it, questioned it, and sometimes even mocked it. A solemn passage on the virtue of humility might be flanked by an image of a peacock, a well-known symbol of vanity strutting proudly just inches away from the holy words. This visual juxtaposition created a moment of cognitive dissonance, prompting the viewer to pause and reconcile the contradiction. Was it a warning against the sin of pride, even when reading about humility, or a humorous reminder that no one, not even the reader, is immune to such failings? This layered interaction transformed the manuscript from a static repository of knowledge into a dynamic tool for meditation and critical thought. This dialogue often took the form of direct reinforcement, where the image served as a perfect visual metaphor for the text's message. A psalm praising God as a mighty fortress might be encircled by an intricate border drawing of a literal castle, its walls strong and impenetrable. In these instances, the margin acted as a magnifying glass, focusing the reader's attention on the core concept and making the abstract idea vividly concrete. This was especially valuable for a partially literate audience or for those being read to, as the picture provided an immediate and accessible entry point into the complex theological language of the main text. The art was not a distraction but a clarification, a bridge between the lofty divine and the understandable human. Yet the more fascinating relationship is one of deliberate dissonance and subversive commentary. In some astonishing examples, the margins seem to directly challenge the authority of the central text. Imagine a prayer book open to a beautifully rendered scene of the crucifixion, a moment of ultimate sacrifice and sorrow. But crowding the edges of this sacred image are grotesque, leering faces not mourners but mockers. These figures, with their distorted features and irreverent expressions, visually echo the biblical Pharisees who taunted Christ on the cross. Their presence does not diminish the power of the central event. Instead, it heightens its emotional stakes. It forces the reader to confront the reality of scorn and suffering, making the devotional exercise more intense and personally affecting. The artist invites the viewer to not just witness the story, but to feel the tension between sanctity and sin, between reverence and ridicule. This complex relationship was far from accidental. Scholars such as Lucy Freeman Sandler have compellingly argued that these interactions were meticulously planned by the artists and scribes. The placement of an image, its subject matter, and its tone were all conscious choices designed to provoke a specific intellectual or spiritual response. A prayer about resisting temptation might be paired with a margin full of seductive sirens, turning the page into a moral gymnasium where the reader could practice the very virtue being preached. This practice anticipated modern concepts of interactive media. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a hyperlink or a pop-up footnote, offering a tangential thought, a contrasting opinion, or a deeper explanation that the reader could choose to explore or ignore. The book became a deeply personal space for reflection, where the path through the content was shaped by the reader's own curiosity and the artist's clever signposts. This intricate dance between word and image ensured that no two readings were ever exactly the same, as each viewer discovered new connections and conversations hidden in plain sight on the parchment. Consider the immense courage it must have taken for a scribe, whose entire life was governed by obedience and hierarchy, to dip his brush and paint a king with the long, foolish ears of a donkey. In an age where such an act could be construed as treason, punishable by imprisonment or worse, the margin became a sanctuary for sedition. This was protest disguised as play, criticism camouflaged within comedy. The artists and scribes who crafted these images developed a sophisticated visual language of resistance, a code that could be understood by those in the know while remaining just ambiguous enough to offer its creator a crucial shield of plausible deniability. If ever confronted, the artist could simply shrug and call it a harmless jest, a bit of foolishness not meant to be taken seriously. This liminal space, neither fully part of the sacred text nor completely separate from it, granted a unique freedom. It was a crack in the facade of absolute authority, and through it, the voices of the silenced began to whisper, then to speak, and finally to laugh. This coded language relied on a shared cultural understanding of symbols. A fox, long a figure of trickery in folklore, became the perfect stand-in for a corrupt clergyman. An image of this sly creature dressed in vestments, preaching earnestly to a flock of mesmerized geese, was a blistering indictment of clerical hypocrisy. The message was clear: the shepherd is a predator, and the faithful are merely his next meal. Similarly, placing a jester's cap, the classic symbol of the fool, on the head of a nobleman or a king was a way to visually strip him of his dignity and question his judgment without ever uttering a seditious word. These weren't random insults, they were calculated critiques, using humor as a Trojan horse to smuggle dissent past the gates of power. The joke was the vehicle, but the payload was a serious commentary on the failures and follies of the ruling class. This form of covert communication was a vital outlet for more than just the educated scribes. It gave a visual voice to the grievances of the vast, illiterate peasantry, whose frustrations would never be recorded in official chronicles. The lower clergy, who witnessed the luxuries of their bishops firsthand, could use these images to express their own disillusionment. For women, largely excluded from formal power structures, the margins could become a space to subtly comment on their world. A common scene shows a woman forcefully pulling her husband's beard, a comical image that nonetheless hints at domestic tensions and the potential for female agency, however symbolic, within a patriarchal society. In this way, Marginalia acted as a pressure valve for the entire social order, allowing steam to escape in a controlled, creative burst rather than a dangerous explosion. Decoding these hidden messages today allows us to uncover a hidden history of resilience. It shows us that oppression was never met with total silence, but with the ingenious, subversive creativity of the powerless. These quiet acts of rebellion, etched in ink and varnish, teach us that art has always been a powerful weapon for those who lack swords. It demonstrates that laughter can be a form of resistance, and that a well-aimed joke, hidden in plain sight, can sometimes be more destabilizing to authority than a shouted insult. The enduring power of these images lies in their brave, human insistence on critique, on holding a mirror to power and daring to point out that the emperor, or perhaps the king, has donkey ears. But just as the art of the margin reached its peak of complexity and subversion, a technological earthquake was rumbling across Europe, one that would fundamentally reshape the world of books and challenge the very existence of the scribe's secret canvas. The invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450 did not instantly erase centuries of tradition, but it began a profound and irreversible transition. The first printed books, known as incarnabula, from the Latin for cradle or swaddling clothes, are fascinating hybrids caught between two worlds. To make these newfangled printed objects acceptable to a wealthy clientele accustomed to the luxury of manuscripts, printers often left wide, blank margins on the page, specifically designed to be hand-illuminated after printing. Skilled artists were employed to fill these spaces with painted initials, floral borders, and even familiar drolleries and grotesques, using the same techniques and colors as their monastic predecessors. For a brief, beautiful period, the old world and the new existed side by side. You could own a mass-produced text, but its margins were still a unique, handcrafted work of art, a last echo of the Scriptorium in the age of the machine. This harmony, however, was short-lived. The driving force of the printing press was efficiency and standardization. The economic model was built on producing hundreds of identical copies from a single set of type, a process utterly at odds with the slow, personalized, and expensive art of hand-painting each book's borders. As the market for books expanded beyond the aristocracy to the growing merchant and professional classes, the demand for affordable text skyrocketed. The lavish, illuminated margin, a symbol of status and luxury, became a casualty of this democratization. It was simply too costly and time-consuming to sustain in an era of mass production. The brush and the quill, tools of individual expression, began to be overshadowed by the mechanized precision of the press. The margin, once a playground for personal rebellion and wit, was in danger of becoming a blank, silent space, a testament to efficiency over individuality. Yet the spirit of Marginalia refused to vanish entirely. It simply evolved, adapting to the new technology. Printers soon began incorporating woodcut and later metal-cut illustrations into their books, and these images frequently migrated from the body of the text to the borders. These printed margins could not replicate the spontaneous charm of a monk's doodle, but they carried on the tradition in a new form. We see decorative borders with repeated patterns of vines and flowers, and perhaps more importantly, we see thematic woodcuts that serve a similar function to their hand-painted ancestors, providing commentary, illustration, and even humor. A book of hours printed in Paris might feature a border of skulls and bones surrounding a prayer, a memento mori reminding the reader of mortality. A legal text might have a printed border of scales of justice. The medium had changed from paint to ink, from unique to repeated, but the fundamental idea of the margin as a space for visual amplification persisted. This transition from manuscript to print is about far more than just changing production methods. It mirrors a massive cultural shift from a society built on custom and oral tradition to one increasingly oriented towards standardization and visual uniformity. The printed book created a fixed, authoritative text, the same in every copy. Knowledge began to solidify, and the playful, ambiguous, often contradictory voice of the margin was, for a time, quieted. Yet the artistic motifs born in those parchment borders proved incredibly resilient. The grotesques and hybrid creatures so beloved by medieval illuminators escaped the page and crawled up the walls of Renaissance palaces, inspiring the lavish grotesque decorations in the Vatican loggias designed by Raphael. The subversive humor and social satire found a new home in the broadside and the political cartoon. The essence of Marginalia, the urge to comment, to decorate, to question from the edges, did not die. It found new mediums and new audiences, ensuring that the secret language of the margins would continue to whisper, even in a world of standardized type. For centuries, these brilliant, bizarre margins were largely dismissed by scholars as meaningless doodles, the idle pastimes of monks with nothing better to do. The real focus was always on the central text, the scripture, the law, the philosophy, while the art in the borders was treated as a curious but ultimately unimportant footnote. It wasn't until the 19th century that a new breed of collector, the romantic antiquarian, began to see these drawings not as flaws but as fascinating features. Picture one of these early enthusiasts in a dusty library, carefully unwrapping a forgotten medieval psalter. His eyes would glide past the familiar Latin verses, only to widen in genuine delight at the sight of a grinning hare brandishing a sword from the edge of the page. He wasn't just seeing a mistake, he was seeing a personality, a joke centuries old, and a glimpse into a world far more complex and human than anyone had previously imagined. Yet this appreciative curiosity was still a far cry from serious academic study. The true turning point came in the 20th century, when pioneering art historians began to argue that these images were not random but packed with meaning. In 1966, Lillian Randall published her monumental work, Images in the Margins of Gothic Manuscripts, which did something radical. It took the material seriously. She catalogued and categorized these scenes, treating them as a coherent body of work worthy of analysis. She was the first to systematically demonstrate that these images often related directly to the text they surrounded, engaging in a complex visual dialogue. Then, a generation later, the scholar Michael Camille truly blew the doors open with his revolutionary book, Image on the Edge. Camille went further, arguing that Marginalia was a space of subversion and resistance, a place where medieval people could explore taboo subjects, critique authority, and express their fears and desires. He shifted the entire conversation, moving Marginalia from the periphery of art history directly into its center, forcing us to see these manuscripts as whole, integrated, and deeply psychological objects. This academic revolution has been supercharged in our own digital age, where once a scholar had to travel the world to a handful of elite libraries to view these precious books. Now high-resolution digitization projects are bringing them to everyone. Institutions like the British Library and the Getty Museum are putting entire manuscripts online for free, allowing anyone with an internet connection to zoom in and explore these margins in breathtaking detail. This accessibility has sparked a tidal wave of popular and scholarly interest. Suddenly, a meme page can feature a knight fighting a snail, and thousands of people encounter medieval humor for the first time. Online communities dissect the meanings behind these strange scenes, sharing their discoveries and theories, creating a vibrant, global conversation about art that was once seen only by a privileged few. It's this unique combination of creativity, humor, and raw humanity that explains why Marginalia resonates so powerfully with a modern audience. We look at these images and we don't see distant, alien medieval people, we see ourselves. We recognize the universal urge to doodle in a boring meeting, to scribble a joke in the margins of a textbook, to use humor as a shield against absurdity. We see in these scenes a precursor to our own forms of satire and graphic storytelling: the political cartoon, the comic book, the internet meme. They all serve the same essential function: using images to comment on power, to share a joke, and to connect with others. This is why major museums now dedicate entire exhibitions to the art of the margin, and why new publications continue to explore its secrets. We have finally learned to look beyond the center of the page, to appreciate the truth that sometimes the most important stories are not shouted from the rooftops, but whispered in the margins. We can almost hear the quiet sigh of a monk, his hand cramping from hours of forming perfect, identical letters on the vellum. The sacred text before him is flawless, a testament to his devotion and discipline. But then his gaze drifts to the wide, empty border, and his quill, almost of its own accord, sketches a tiny, scowling face or a figure throwing down its pen in a fit of comic frustration. This is more than a doodle, it is a psychological fingerprint, a direct line into the mental and emotional state of a person who lived centuries ago. By examining these marginal outbursts, we move beyond analyzing art and start analyzing the artist's mind, uncovering the universal human needs that persisted even within the rigid structure of medieval life. Think of these drawings as a form of medieval therapy, a necessary pressure valve for minds under immense strain. The work of a scribe was one of excruciating monotony and intense pressure, demanding unwavering focus amidst physical discomfort. In this context, the margin became a sanctioned space for a mental break, a place to vent the universal frustrations of any dedicated worker. That drawing of a sleeping monk isn't just a joke, it's a confession of exhaustion, a relatable admission of human limitation. A sketch of a man rubbing his hands together for warmth is a silent complaint about the frigid scriptorium. These images are visual sighs, allowing the artist to acknowledge their hardship, and in sharing that tiny moment of humor with an imagined future viewer, find a small measure of relief and connection. This practice aligns perfectly with our modern understanding of how creativity serves as a coping mechanism, a way to manage stress and reclaim a sense of agency in a demanding environment. Beyond simple frustration, the recurring themes in Marginalia offer a window into the collective subconscious of the medieval world. The persistent, haunting depictions of grotesque monsters and demons might reflect a deep-seated anxiety about the unknown fears of disease, famine, and the very real belief in supernatural forces that lurked beyond the safety of the monastery walls. These were not just imaginary creatures, they were visual manifestations of the period's pervasive uncertainties. Conversely, the delightfully absurd scenes, like the now famous knight battling a snail, could represent a cognitive release from that very anxiety. Engaging with the ridiculous and the illogical allows the brain to break free from constant worry, providing a moment of levity and mental reset. The same mind that feared the devil could also find profound relief in the sheer nonsense of a rabbit serving as a town crier. Perhaps most powerfully, these margins became a rare space for the expression of individual identity in a world that often suppressed it. The scribe's primary task was self-effacement, to copy text without error and without injecting any personal flair into the lettering. The margin was the one place where their individuality could not only emerge but flourish. The specific way one artist drew a dog's fur, the unique smirk on a gargoyle's face, or the choice to depict a particular folk tale, these were personal signatures. Through these choices, the anonymous artisan tells us, "I was here, I had a sense of humor, I saw the world in this particular way." This transforms them from a faceless copyist into a recognizable person with a unique perspective, reminding us that the need to express oneself is a timeless human drive, as powerful in the 14th century as it is on social media today. This psychological perspective doesn't just explain the drawings, it fundamentally humanizes the countless anonymous hands that built the foundation of our written history. To truly appreciate the unique brilliance of the Luttrell Psalter, we must first meet the man behind it. Sir Geoffrey Luttrell was a wealthy English landowner from Lincolnshire, and in the early 14th century he commissioned a Psalter, a book of psalms for personal devotion, that would become one of the most famous and idiosyncratic manuscripts in the world. Unlike many patrons who sought to outdo each other with displays of pure gold and biblical splendor, Sir Geoffrey had a different vision. He instructed the artists to fill the margins of his holy book with the world he knew intimately, the bustling, muddy, and vibrant life of his own estate. The result is a breathtakingly detailed and often humorous panorama that feels less like a traditional devotional text and more like a visual diary of the entire medieval English countryside. Open to any page and you are immediately transported. The lower margins, in particular, unfold in continuous narratives that are astonishing in their realism. We don't just see a generic peasant, we see a specific man, his face lined with effort, guiding a heavy plow pulled by a team of oxen. We witness the entire agricultural cycle in meticulous detail. Women bending to sow seeds in neatly furrowed rows, laborers swinging sickles to cut the ripe wheat, and teams threshing and winnowing the grain. The artists captured not just the actions, but the sounds and textures of this life, the clank of a blacksmith's hammer, the steam rising from a pot of pottage at a harvest feast, the determined tug of a farmer's wife leading a stubborn donkey. This is documentary realism centuries before the invention of the camera, offering an unparalleled window into the daily routines that sustained medieval society. Yet, for all its grounded detail, the Psalter is also a work of delightful fantasy and warm humor, seamlessly blending the real with the surreal. Right alongside a scene of a woman feeding chickens, a grotesque hybrid creature with a man's head and a bird's body might be pecking at the ground. A knight jousts with a snail near a depiction of the Luttrell family coat of arms. At the bottom of a particularly solemn psalm, a band of musicians, one playing a bagpipe, another a harp, accompanies a line of dancers, their movements so lively you can almost hear the music. This whimsy is the Psalter's secret weapon. It doesn't feel like a cold record. It feels alive, infused with the personality and wit of its creators and its patron. The margins celebrate the joy and communal spirit of rural life, from a boisterous feast where servants carry in platters of food to a family gathered warmly around a hearth. This leads us to the great scholarly debate surrounding the Psalter. Are we seeing an idealization or a subtle critique? Sir Geoffrey Luttrell is depicted in a full-page illustration, resplendent in his armor, being handed his helmet by his wife and daughter-in-law. This image projects an ideal of chivalric nobility and harmonious feudal order, with the Lord as the benevolent protector of his land and people. The plentiful harvest scenes could be read as a celebration of this order, showcasing the wealth and productivity of his well-run estate. However, other scholars suggest a more nuanced reading. Could the exaggerated, almost cartoonish faces of some laborers be a form of gentle mockery, a reflection of the aristocratic patron's view of his social inferiors? Does the inclusion of a woman swatting a thief with her distaff comment on domestic tensions? The genius of the Luttrell Psalter is that it holds both interpretations in perfect balance. It is both a proud portrait of a lord's domain and an unvarnished, empathetic look at the people who worked it, acknowledging both the dignity of their labor and the comedy of their everyday struggles. What ultimately makes the Luttrell Psalter a monumental achievement in marginal art is this profound sense of personalization. This wasn't a generic book made for an anonymous market. It was custom-made for one man to reflect his identity, his values, and his world. The sacred psalms provide the constant spiritual framework, but the margins are where Sir Geoffrey's earthly life and faith intertwine. The prayer book becomes a bridge between his soul and his soil, between divine contemplation and the very tangible reality of his estate. It transforms the act of prayer from an abstract meditation into a thanksgiving for the specific, messy, and beautiful world outside his window, forever immortalizing the smell of turned earth, the taste of harvest bread, and the sound of laughter in the margins of a psalm. Now let us turn from the earthy, bustling world of the Luttrell Psalter to an object of astonishing refinement and intimacy, the Hours of Jean Devereux. This is not a book for public display in a great hall, but a precious jewel meant to be held in the hands of a queen. Created in the early 14th century by the unparalleled artist Jean Pucelle for the young French queen, this Book of Hours is a masterpiece of miniature scale and maximal artistry. Its pages, barely larger than a modern smartphone, are a gateway into the most rarefied and elegant circles of medieval power, revealing how Marginalia was meticulously tailored not for satire, but for the soul of its specific owner. The most immediate and stunning feature of this manuscript is its artistic technique. Pucelle and his workshop employed a method known as grisaille, painting entirely in shades of gray, white, and black, often with subtle touches of color on the lips and cheeks of figures. This monochromatic scheme creates a world of breathtaking delicacy and soft light, mimicking the appearance of carved ivory sculptures, which were the height of luxury in the royal courts. The effect is one of sophisticated restraint, a quiet elegance that draws the viewer into a state of deep contemplation. The margins are not filled with the riotous, colorful chaos of other manuscripts, but with intricate architectural frameworks, Gothic arches, delicate columns, and winding vines that form a structured and beautiful frame for the central devotional scenes. This alone signals a shift in purpose. The margin here is not a space for rebellion, but a carefully designed stage for reinforcing devotion and status. Within these refined borders, the Marginalia performs a delicate dance between the sacred and the courtly. Yes, we find the expected drolleries, a monkey mimicking a physician, an ape playing a viol, a rabbit trumpeter. but they are executed with a grace and wit that feels more like charming entertainment than subversive satire. These whimsical figures are not mocking the text, they are accompanying it, providing a moment of gentle levity amidst the seriousness of prayer. They reflect the cultured amusement of the aristocracy, the same taste that enjoyed jesters, minstrels, and sophisticated pageantry. The humor is light, the absurdity is polished, and it all serves to make the act of private devotion a more delightful and engaging experience for the Queen. Yet the true genius of this manuscript's Marginalia lies in its deeply personal connection to Jeanne d'Evreux herself. The book is peppered with scenes that directly reflect her life and duties. We see depictions of a queen, much like Jeanne, kneeling in prayer, often accompanied by her coat of arms. The biblical scenes are not just general illustrations, they are models for her own conduct. Scenes of the Virgin Mary, the ultimate queenly model of humility and grace, would have served as a direct exemplar for the young queen. Furthermore, the margins are populated with figures enacting the 7 works of mercy, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, clothing the naked. This was not merely a random selection. It was a visual guidebook for a queen's charitable duties, a constant reminder that her immense privilege came with the responsibility to care for her subjects. The book becomes a mirror, reflecting and shaping her identity as both a devout Christian and a benevolent sovereign. This carefully curated world stands in stark contrast to the more subversive margins of monastic books. There is no knight fighting a snail here, no fox preaching to geese, no explicit critique of clerical authority. The Marginalia in the hours of Jeanne d'Evreux is fundamentally supportive, designed to comfort, inspire, and affirm the owner's place in the divine and social order. It reinforces the themes of the central text rather than questioning them. This distinction powerfully demonstrates that Marginalia was not a monolithic practice with a single purpose. Its character was entirely dependent on its audience. For a monk, the margin was a rare space for personal expression within a rigid structure. For a queen, it was a space to reinforce her piety and power, to surround herself with images that confirmed her world rather than challenged it. Even within this supportive framework, Pucell's artistry injects profound humanity. In the grisale scenes of the Passion of Christ, the marginal figures are not grotesque mockers, but mourners who model a heartfelt, empathetic response for the Queen. Their grief is palpable, their gestures full of grace and sorrow, guiding Jeanne on how to feel and respond to the sacred story. This emotional resonance transforms the book from a simple status symbol into a truly intimate companion for meditation. The Hours of Jeanne d'Evreux shows us the ultimate flexibility of the medieval margin. It could be a bawdy joke book, a satirical pamphlet, a farmer's almanac, or, as in this case, a luxurious and deeply personal guide to living a life of faith and duty, proving that these illuminated edges were always a conversation specifically designed for the person holding the book. Stepping from the general to the specific, the margins offer a startlingly detailed and often contradictory portrait of medieval womanhood. Here, the idealized Virgin Mary might share a page with a violent shrew, and a pious nun could be depicted right beside a seductive temptress. These weren't random contradictions, they were a direct reflection of the deeply conflicted attitudes toward women in the Middle Ages, caught between the exalted ideal of spiritual purity and the pervasive fear of female sexuality and power. The margin became the arena where this societal anxiety was played out, revealing both the rigid stereotypes women were forced to navigate and the rare, fascinating glimpses of their real, lived agency. One of the most common roles assigned to women in the margins is that of the villain or the shrew. In these scenes, we witness the medieval version of a domestic sitcom filled with physical, slapstick humor. A wife is shown brandishing a distaff or a rolling pin, chasing her cowering husband or pulling his beard. These images undoubtedly reinforced a popular stereotype of the nagging, emasculating woman, a figure of fun meant to caution against domineering wives and champion male authority in the household. Yet, to modern eyes, there's also a subversive charge to these scenes. They acknowledge, however comically, that the home could be a site of female power and resistance. The very fact that these battles were deemed worthy of depiction suggests that the ideal of the quiet, submissive wife was just that, an ideal that was frequently challenged in the messy reality of daily life. Conversely, the other powerful stereotype was the temptress, the embodiment of dangerous female sexuality that could lead a man's soul to damnation. This is where we find images of seductive sirens luring sailors with their songs, or naked women bathing, their glances inviting and perilous. These figures served as clear moral warnings, visual aids in the Church's ongoing project of controlling female desire and promoting chastity. They represent the medieval fear of the unruly female body, a force that needed to be constantly guarded and suppressed. Yet, even here, complexity arises. Some of these erotic images, particularly those found in the margins of texts owned by male religious orders, might have served a dual purpose officially. They were warnings against sin, but unofficially, they may have provided a sanctioned outlet for the very desires they condemned. But to focus only on these extremes is to miss the rich documentation of women's actual labor and lives. The margins are filled with women at work, depicted with a matter-of-fact dignity that often feels more truthful than the caricatures. We see them spinning wool, a task so quintessentially female that the distaff became a symbol of womanhood itself. They are shown brewing ale, tending market stalls, baking bread, and managing poultry-essential economic activities that formed the backbone of the medieval household and local economy. These are not figures of fun or objects of fear. They are active, capable participants in the survival of their communities. This visual record is invaluable as it celebrates the often invisible labor of ordinary women, granting them a presence in history that written documents often overlook. Perhaps most importantly, the margins occasionally show us women not as subjects, but as patrons and owners, the audience for these very books. A wealthy noblewoman might be depicted in the margin herself, kneeling in prayer, presented by a saint to the Virgin Mary. Her coat of arms would be displayed prominently, marking the book as her personal property. This was more than just a portrait. It was a statement of power, piety, and cultural influence. Women like Jean Devereux, who commissioned stunning books of hours, were active consumers and commissioners of art. They used these objects to shape their spiritual identity and project their social status. By including themselves in the margins, they asserted their role not as passive observers of medieval culture, but as its active financiers and creators, leaving an indelible mark on some of the most beautiful artifacts of the age. Through this lens, the varied portrayals in the margins tell a story of tension between fear and respect, between stereotype and reality, and between the limited roles prescribed to women and the subtle, powerful ways they carved out space for themselves within those constraints. Now, let's step into the shoes of a medieval believer, perhaps a wealthy noblewoman in her private chapel or a monk in the quiet of his cell. They open their book of hours, a deeply personal devotional text, and their eyes don't just scan the words of a psalm. They are immediately drawn into a vibrant world that unfolds in the borders. This was never a mere reading exercise. It was a full-bodied, multisensory spiritual journey, and the Marginalia served as the essential guide, transforming abstract prayer into a vivid, immersive experience. The margins here are not for satire or social commentary. They are a carefully constructed spiritual toolkit designed to elevate the soul through the power of sight. Think of these devotional images as a form of visual liturgy. For a prayer focusing on the Passion of Christ, the central text might be a block of Latin words. But encircling it, the margin could depict a continuous narrative. In one corner, Christ stumbles under the weight of the cross. In another, Saint Veronica offers her veil. Further along, the nails are being driven into his hands. This visual storytelling allowed the reader to not just recite the words, but to mentally walk the Via Dolorosa alongside Christ, engaging their empathy and compassion in a way that text alone could never achieve. For the illiterate, these images were the entire sermon, making the sacred stories accessible and unforgettable. For the educated, they provided a focal point for deeper meditation, a prompt to move beyond intellectual understanding into heartfelt connection. The margin acted as a stage, dramatizing the text and pulling the worshipper directly into the sacred scene. Even the most bizarre and seemingly out-of-place grotesques could be recruited for this holy purpose. A strange, hybrid creature with a contorted body might not be a random monster, but a deliberate symbol of the sin of avarice or pride, its distorted form reflecting a soul twisted by vice. Placed next to a prayer asking for forgiveness and moral strength, this image becomes a potent reminder of what the worshipper is striving to overcome. The playful image of a monkey, often a symbol of base human instinct and foolishness, trying and failing to mimic a pious action, could serve as a gentle, self-deprecating warning against empty ritual or lack of sincere devotion. The humor here is not frivolous, it's pedagogical. By making the abstract concept of sin into a tangible, often ridiculous-looking creature, the artist made the spiritual struggle relatable and the lesson far more memorable than a straightforward theological lecture could ever be. This practice transformed the act of reading into an active, participatory dialogue with the divine. The book was no longer a passive object but an interactive device for spiritual formation. A reader might move their finger from the text to a marginal image of a saint, using that holy figure as an intercessor or a model for their own prayers. The intricate, beautiful borders of flowers and vines were not just decoration. They were a reflection of God's creation, a visual hymn that encouraged the reader to see the beauty of the divine in the natural world. Every element on the page, the gleam of gold leaf representing divine light, the vibrant colors symbolizing different theological virtues, the very effort and expense of the book itself combined to create an atmosphere of reverence and wonder. This multisensory engagement touching the vellum, seeing the brilliant images, speaking the words aloud, anchored the worshipper's entire being in the act of prayer, making devotion a holistic experience that engaged the mind, the heart, and the senses in the pursuit of grace. It's incredibly tempting to look at a 700-year-old drawing of a rabbit exacting revenge on a hunter and see a modern parable of the underdog fighting back against oppression, or to interpret a bizarre hybrid creature as a straightforward expression of the artist's subconscious anxieties. While these contemporary perspectives can feel immediately satisfying, they risk doing a profound disservice to the medieval mind that created them. The greatest challenge and the greatest responsibility in appreciating Marginalia is to resist the urge to view it solely through a 21st century lens. We must step back from our own worldviews, our own political frameworks, and our own psychological theories, and instead strive to enter the vastly different intellectual and cultural landscape of the Middle Ages. This isn't about dismissing modern insights, but about balancing them with a rigorous respect for historical context, ensuring our appreciation is built on understanding rather than projection. Consider the explicitly erotic imagery found in so many margins. A modern viewer might be quick to label these images as rebellious or progressive, a bold celebration of sexuality defiantly sketched beside repressive religious doctrine. But this interpretation imports a very modern concept of sexual liberation into a world that simply did not think in those terms. For the medieval artist and viewer, these scenes were far more likely to be understood as moral warnings against the sin of lust, designed to provoke not arousal but a fearful aversion. Their shocking contrast with the sacred text was the entire point. It heightened the lesson's impact. Alternatively, some of these images might have served as inside jokes or satirical jabs at the celibacy required of clergy, acknowledging human frailty rather than championing liberation. To see only a proto-feminist statement or a progressive stance is to overlook the complex and often deeply conservative moral universe they actually inhabited. Similarly, our post-Freudian world is predisposed to see the grotesque and the monstrous as projections of inner psychological turmoil, the scribe's hidden fears or personal demons given form. Yet while medieval people certainly experienced fear and anxiety, they conceptualized these emotions differently. A grotesque hybrid creature was less likely to be a symbol of an individual's private mental state and more likely to represent a widely believed in external reality, the literal existence of demons, the tangible threat of sin, or the mysterious wonders of God's creation, which was thought to include all sorts of bizarre beings in far-off lands. The monster in the margin wasn't a metaphor for depression. It was a depiction of a real theological danger that was believed to be constantly prowling the edges of the human soul, waiting for a moment of weakness. Interpreting it as a simple psychological projection flattens its rich, multi-layered meaning into a modern cliché. So how do we bridge this gap? How can we hope to understand what these images truly meant? The answer lies in a kind of intellectual archaeology, carefully excavating the period's own symbols, beliefs, and artistic conventions. This requires immersing ourselves in the other books they read, the bestiaries that catalogued mythical creatures with absolute seriousness, the sermons that warned of specific sins, the popular folktales and courtly romances that filled the cultural air. It means recognizing that a fox will almost always symbolize trickery, a rabbit might represent lust or cowardice, and a snail could be a symbol of the resurrection or of the Lombards, a group frequently mocked for cowardice. The meaning wasn't arbitrary, it was drawn from a shared cultural lexicon that the original audience would have instantly recognized. This ethical approach to interpretation is not about locking these images into one fixed, boring meaning. The medieval mind loved ambiguity, allegory, and layered interpretations. An image could simultaneously function as a moral warning, a humorous gag, and a clever visual pun. The key is that all those potential meanings were generated from within the medieval worldview itself, not imposed from outside it. By striving for this historical accuracy, we do more than just avoid academic error. We honor the complexity and sophistication of the people who created this art. We treat them not as primitive doodlers waiting for us to explain their work with our modern theories, but as intelligent, creative, and nuanced individuals communicating in their own sophisticated visual language. This respectful engagement allows the margins to speak on their own terms, revealing a past that is far stranger, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating than any simple modern projection could ever be. The vibrant, unruly spirit of the medieval margin refused to be confined to parchment. As the Gothic age gave way to the Renaissance, the grotesques and drolleries that had flourished in the borders of sacred texts crawled off the page and onto the walls of palaces and the sketchbooks of masters. The Vatican itself became a new canvas for this ancient aesthetic when Raphael and his workshop adorned the loggias with lavish stucco and painted decorations known as grotesque, a term derived from the grotto-like ruins of ancient Rome where such designs were rediscovered. But these were not mere copies, they were Renaissance reimaginings. The playful hybrid creatures and intricate, nonsensical foliage were stripped of their immediate devotional context and repurposed as expressions of a new, humanist curiosity, a delight in the sheer inventiveness of art for its own sake. Look at the margins of a Leonardo da Vinci notebook, and you see the same inquisitive impulse that drove the monastic scribe. His pages are a glorious chaos of anatomical studies, hydraulic engineering, and tucked in the corners, fantastical caricatures of grimacing old men and bizarre monsters. This is the legacy of Marginalia, the artistic freedom to explore the bizarre and the beautiful in the spaces between serious work. This subversive thread woven through art history finds a powerful echo in the 20th century with the Surrealists, who made the irrational and the subconscious the very subject of their work. Artists like Hieronymus Bosch, whose dreamlike and monstrous tableau feel like an entire manuscript's worth of marginalia exploded onto a massive panel, became a direct ancestor to Salvador Dali and Max Ernst. The Surrealist practice of automatism, drawing without conscious control to access the inner mind, is a direct parallel to the seemingly impulsive, free associative doodling of a medieval scribe. Both practices value the unplanned, the accidental, and the psychologically charged image that emerges from the edge of thought. The medieval artist's rabbit-turned knight is a close cousin to René Magritte's floating bowler hats and apple-faced men. Both use absurdity and visual puns to challenge our perception of reality and undermine conventional logic. The margin for both was a state of mind, a psychic space where the normal rules were suspended and anything could happen. This enduring spirit finds its most potent modern expression in the democratic and anarchic world of internet memes. Think about it, a meme is pure digital marginalia. It exists in the liminal spaces of our screens, in the comment sections, the social media feeds, the edges of our digital consciousness. It takes a central image or idea, a main text from popular culture, and surrounds it with a witty, critical, or absurd caption that completely subverts its original meaning. The format is a direct descendant of the medieval model, a central figure, often a politician or celebrity. Our modern-day nobility and clergy is surrounded by a textual and visual gloss that mocks, critiques, or reduces them to absurdity. The visual language of memes, with their grunge textures, impact font, and deliberately crude edits, is the modern equivalent of the hurried, sketchy line of a marginal doodle. They are created not by master illuminators for an elite patron, but by anonymous users for a mass audience, yet they serve the exact same function, using humor as a weapon to speak truth to power and to build community through shared inside jokes. A viral image of a knight futilely jousting a snail would feel perfectly at home on a modern subreddit. This continuity reveals something profound about the human condition. The urge to annotate, to comment, to poke fun, and to claim a little creative space for oneself is a timeless constant. From the monastic scriptorium to the royal court, from the printing press to the pixelated screen, we have always sought out the edges to express what cannot be said in the center. The political cartoon in a newspaper, which distills complex current events into a single, satirical image in the margin of the front page, is a direct linear descendant of the fox preaching to the geese. The graphic novel, with its panels that can break free of the grid to provide internal monologue, symbolic asides, and surreal digressions, uses its own margins to create a layered narrative dialogue. This isn't a coincidence, it's a testament to a fundamental human need. We are inherently drawn to the periphery, to the space where the official story ends and the personal, the subversive, and the brilliantly weird can begin. The history of art isn't just a history of central masterpieces. It is equally a history of the doodles in their borders, a vibrant, enduring tradition of finding voice and verve in the spaces in between. But the human urge to comment, to critique, and to create in the spaces between official narratives didn't vanish with the printing press. It simply evolved, finding a new and incredibly powerful home in the digital realm. If we squint at our smartphone screens, we can see the direct descendants of those medieval scribes all around us. The vibrant, chaotic, and endlessly inventive world of internet memes is our modern marginalia. Think about it, a meme almost always exists in the margins of a larger cultural moment. It takes a central image, a politician's awkward pause, a frame from a popular movie, a celebrity's expressive reaction, and surrounds it with a new layer of meaning, a textual gloss that subverts, satirizes, or reinterprets the original. This is the exact same visual dialogue that happened 700 years ago, where a pious text was flanked by a mocking fox. The digital comment section, the quote tweet, the subreddit dedicated to roasting a poorly received product. These are all our contemporary margins, spaces where the collective voice of the people can talk back to the main event. Social media platforms themselves have become our global, digital scriptoria. They are the shared spaces where individuals, much like those anonymous monks, gather to express uncensored truths and personal frustrations. A user crafting a witty tweet about a current event is engaging in the same act of coded commentary as a scribe sketching a king with donkey ears. Both understand their audience will get the joke, and both use the tools at their disposal, whether a fine brush or a meme generator, to speak truth to power without necessarily putting their name to a formal, dangerous accusation. These platforms provide the same psychological release valve that the parchment margin did, a place to vent, to connect with like-minded individuals, and to build a sense of community around shared humor and critique. The viral spread of a particularly sharp meme mirrors the way a successful marginal motif, like the knight and the snail, would be copied and shared across different monastic communities, becoming a kind of inside joke for an entire continent. This comparison reveals something profound about enduring human behavior. Our need to claim a little creative space for ourselves, to use the edges and peripheries to voice dissent and share jokes, is a constant across centuries. Technology doesn't create this impulse, it simply provides it with new tools and a vastly larger canvas. The medieval artist had a few square inches of vellum, we have the entire internet. But the core motivations, the desire to push back, to find fellowship in laughter, and to assert our individuality within a larger, often impersonal system remain strikingly familiar. Understanding the long history of marginalia can deeply enrich our appreciation of these modern forms. It shows us that the meme is not some degenerate new art form, but part of a noble and ancient tradition of using creativity as a tool for resilience and resistance. So what lessons can we, navigating our own complex world of censorship and creative expression, learn from these medieval masters? They were experts in the art of plausible deniability, using symbolism, allegory, and absurdity to make their points in a way that was just ambiguous enough to protect them. This is a crucial skill in any environment where speaking directly can carry a cost. They also understood the power of humor as a Trojan horse, a way to deliver a serious message wrapped in a package so delightful and engaging that it disarms criticism. And perhaps most importantly, their work teaches us the value of looking to the margins, to the comments, the subcultures, the seemingly silly spaces, to find the most authentic, uncensored, and human responses to the central narratives of our time. The illuminated margins of the past tell us that the truth isn't always found in the headline or the official decree. Very often, it's hiding in the reaction GIF, the viral video, and the perfectly timed joke waiting just off to the side. In an age where our digital feeds are constantly flooded with official statements, polished narratives, and centralized news cycles, the chaotic, handwritten truth of medieval marginalia feels more vital than ever. It stands as a powerful testament to the fact that history was never a single, monolithic story written by the powerful, but a cacophony of countless diverse voices, many of which were deliberately excluded from the main record. These margins remind us that the human spirit has always found ways to speak its truth, to crack jokes in the face of authority, and to assert its individuality, even under the most restrictive circumstances. They teach us a crucial lesson for navigating our own era of information overload and polarized discourse. The most profound insights are very often found not in the screaming headlines, but in the quiet comments, the shared memes, and the subcultural spaces, the digital margins of our time. This ancient practice is an invitation to become better, more critical readers of our own world, to actively look beyond the center and seek out the hidden, the dissenting, and the creatively subversive perspectives that offer a more complete and human picture of reality. The spirit of marginalia also champions creativity not as a luxury, but as a fundamental tool for human resilience and truth-telling. For those medieval scribes, a quick doodle was a lifeline, a way to maintain their sanity and humanity amidst immense tedium and pressure. Today, we can apply that same principle to our own lives. It encourages us to claim our own creative margins, whether that's journaling in the edges of a planner, sketching during a long meeting, or using a hobby to process the complexities of daily life. This isn't about becoming a professional artist. It's about recognizing that the act of making something, a joke, a meal, a garden, a playlist, is a powerful way to assert our presence in the world and make sense of our experiences. It is in these personal, often unpolished creations that we, like the scribes before us, can navigate complexity, express our inner worlds, and find genuine joy and meaning. Ultimately, this connection across centuries is what makes marginalia so profoundly moving. Gazing at a 700-year-old drawing of a knight defeated by a snail, we are not looking at a quaint artifact from a distant past. We are recognizing a shared joke, a universal sigh, a familiar gesture of defiance. We are connecting with the humanity of someone long gone, realizing that they too knew boredom, frustration, love, and the need to laugh at their superiors. This realization collapses time, reminding us that people have always used art and humor as a way to cope, to connect, and to endure. By embracing the spirit of marginalia today, by valuing the edges, championing diverse voices, and fearlessly engaging in creative expression, we do more than just honor the past. We actively ensure that the full, rich, messy, and wonderful spectrum of human experience continues to be documented, not just in the official records of our time, but in the beautiful, necessary, and enduring margins we choose to create. As we close this journey through the illuminated margins, it's worth pausing to consider the sheer weight of what these tiny, defiant artworks represent. They are not mere historical curiosities or amusing footnotes to a more serious past. They are, in fact, a powerful and enduring testament to the unbreakable human spirit, to our innate need for creativity, our relentless sense of humor, and our profound resilience in the face of constraint. For centuries, these images were dismissed as the idle doodles of bored monks, but we now understand they were so much more. They were a secret language of the soul, a way for individuals living under immense religious and social pressure to whisper their truths, share their frustrations, and preserve their joy. They prove that even when authority controls the central text of life, the human imagination will always find a way to claim its own space in the margins. This legacy challenges us directly in our modern world. We are constantly presented with official narratives, polished headlines, and centralized stories that demand our attention and acceptance. The lesson from the margins is to become more critical, more curious readers of our own reality. It encourages us to look beyond the glaring center and to seek out the overlooked details, the dissenting comments, the subcultural movements, and the personal stories that often hold a more nuanced and authentic truth. Just as the medieval scribe used symbolism and absurdity to critique power safely, we too can learn the value of reading between the lines and appreciating the complex, often contradictory layers that make up any story. The margins teach us that history is not a single, monolithic tale told by the powerful, but a vibrant tapestry woven from countless individual voices, each adding their own stitch of experience, critique, and beauty. Let this exploration inspire you to find and celebrate the margins in your own life. Look for those spaces where creativity flourishes not in spite of limits, but because of them. Embrace the doodles in your notebook, the inside jokes with friends, the personal projects that may seem small but are deeply meaningful. These are your acts of marginalia, your way of leaving a mark, expressing your individuality, and connecting with others on a human level. The next time you feel confined by circumstance, remember the scribe who, amidst a page of solemn scripture, drew a grinning gargoyle. They chose to create, to critique, and to find joy. And in doing so, they left behind a message of hope that has traveled across centuries to remind us that the most profound truths are very often found not in the loud, centralized narratives, but in the quiet, persistent, and brilliant edges. Thank you for joining us on this exploration. We would love to hear which marginal motif resonated most with you in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more journeys into the hidden corners